Well, Thomas Frank is with us this morning. He's the author of this book, What's the Matter with Kansas? How Conservatives Won the Heart of America. Good morning, Mr. Frank.
How you doing?
Fine. What happened?
What happened?
What happened
in the election?
In the election that mirrored what you wrote about in this book?
It's kind of funny. It's what happened in the election is what happened to Kansas about 15 years ago, isn't it? It's you know, the sort of moderates and the centrists just absolutely swamped by the right, and it should be. You know, the thing is that this should be. It shouldn't be a surprise to anybody anymore that this kind of thing goes on. It's been happening since, well, the phenomenon that we saw last Tuesday, you know, of people voting for their values over their economic interests, or, you know, in a very rough sense, has been going on since 1968. Okay, the Republicans and the conservatives have been using the wedge issues, the culture war issues, with great effect ever since then. What astonishes me is that the Democrats still don't really have a way of defusing this. They don't seem to understand what's happening to them and why. And it keeps happening. Every 4 years it happens again. It's very, very frustrating. But so what happened in Kansas, what my book is about the sort of the ongoing power of these issues, and the kind of right-wing populist revolt that you see sweeping across states like Kansas and much of the middle of America, and ironically states that were once very liberal, if not outright radical. You actually give some history where Kansas was liberal. Yeah, well, I wouldn't say liberal. It was it was radical 100 years ago. Kansas was, well, it goes back further than that. The state was settled by abolitionists and free soilers that went there deliberately to block slave owners from Missouri moving west. And in the 1890s, the state was swept over by what they called populism, which was a sort of radical movement of farmers and workers. And you know, it was this very inspiring moment. All my life, I've read books about populism, and I always thought, gee, what a great moment that was. and then Kansas remained. After that, it was always Republican. Kansas has always been loyal to the Republican Party because of its Civil War, you know, its origins in the Civil War. But it was a different sort of republicanism, personified by people like William Allen White, who was, by today's standards, on the left, or Alf Landon, even, who was the Republican candidate in 1936, but again, by today's standards, very moderate or to liberal, or even Dwight Eisenhower, you know. So, but in recent years, the state has moved further and further to the right, and all based on values issues, the culture war issues, and that fascinates me. So it's an in-depth study of that. Why did you choose Kansas as kind of a microcosm of these others, of what's going on in these states? Well, for one thing, because it's my home state, so it made it easy to do the research, because I still, you know, I have I have friends there, and it's a place that's always fascinated me. It's my home state, and its story is rarely told, you know, that sort of thing. But it's also, Kansas is traditionally used by journalists as a microcosm of America. It's the most average place in America. This is, you know, they say this because it's right in the middle, you know, but also statistically, if you look at the numbers, it actually is very close to the average. You know, in any ranking of the states, it's always number 25, except for in tourism, where it's absolutely last, because it's so familiar. You've been there, you know. You've seen you know what Kansas is like. It's like everywhere else. So back to... I'm kidding, of course. I realize that. So back to this election. Why did people vote against their economic interest, in your opinion? Well, that's a big question, and it takes me 300 pages to answer it in the book, and so I'll try to give you the condensed version. And the bottom line is this, that the conservative movement, the Republican Party also in America, have been very successful at describing, at reaching out to blue-collar voters, and at describing themselves as representatives of the angry, hard-done-by, average American. And this is the essential point about the culture wars that that liberals and Democrats never seem to understand, that this is really about class. That in some ways all of these things are a way of talking about class without talking about the economic aspect of class. And it's very obvious if you know, watch Bill O'Reilly or read their books or something like that. These people talk about class all the time. by these people I mean conservatives, talk about class all the time. In Kansas, the divide, you can see it on the map, the divide between, there's very few Democrats there, even fewer liberals. The main divide is between your old school moderate Republicans and your conservative Republicans, and the divide is between working class neighborhoods and your affluent upper middle class neighborhoods. So that's to make a very, very, very long story short. That's what it's about. It's about this kind of cultural populism.
And you've been seeing it every 4 years for some time.
Yeah, more or less. Yeah. Well, I mean, we can go back over the elections and talk about the issues,
And so, in 4 years, what do Democrats need to do to change that?
See, this is where I'm.
That was a big sigh.
I know. I'm out of my element. I'm fundamentally, I'm a kind of a person that looks backward. I'm a historian, and I like talking about the past, and talking about the future is more difficult for me. And also, I should point out that I just moved to D.C. I'm not from here. I don't understand this town, and I'm no good at polls, and I'm no good at national political strategy. But I can say in the big cultural battle, the great war of position that goes on between the two parties, the Democrats have to come up with a way to defuse culture war populism. They have to come up, and it seems to me that the obvious way is, and this should be easy for the Democrats, because once upon a time they had a very clear and straightforward way of talking to blue-collar voters. That was them. That was who they were. Think of Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman from Kansas City. That's who Democrats were, and they have to recover that way of speaking to those people, to those voters. They have to be able to challenge this kind of phony culture war populism where it's all about the liberal elite and the people with their Volvos and their sushi. You've heard this critique. They have to be able to challenge that with the real deal, with real populism, and talk about who really runs our country and who really benefits from Republican policies and why.
Well, let me look at the newspapers this morning then and ask you two things out of it, see if you think that this is going to help Democrats. One, that Howard Dean is interested in becoming the next head of the Democratic National Committee.
Wow. I like Howard Dean. And one of the things that I liked most about Howard Dean was it was the movement that built up around him, and I thought that was something that Democrats definitely have to capitalize on that if they want to. Part of the big problem here is that Democrats have sort of let the social movement that made their party powerful in the first place, and here I'm referring to things like the labor movement, environmental, whatever. They have let those social movements wither on the vine, and that's terrible. And meanwhile, the conservatives movement, the conservatives have been out there building a movement from the grassroots up ever since the late 60s. They've had enormous success at it. The first thing that Democrats have to do is start working on rebuilding the grassroots movement that made their party possible. And so, for that reason, I think it's very important that they embrace the Dean phenomenon.
And secondly, in the Washington Post this morning, quotes John Kerry as saying he might want to be a candidate in 2008.
Well, that's great. I voted for him. I like the guy. I could criticize his campaign, but I don't want to do that. That's not right.
Let's go to some phone calls.
All right.
Let's go to St. Cloud, Minnesota first. Good morning.
Good morning. My thing with the Democratic Party, I have to defend myself constantly with my Republican friends because of abortion. And the Democrats I believe the Democrats do not believe in abortion, but they don't stress the fact that we just don't believe the government should control women's idea of this thing.
The abortion issue.
Now, as you may or may not know, the abortion issue is the issue that stood Kansas on its head. Beginning in the early 90s, really. This is when Kansas, the politics in that state swerved dramatically to the right, and it did so directly as a result of the way that conservatives played the abortion issue. A huge part of there's no easy answer to this, and that's why it's an issue that conservatives hammer home all the time, because there's no easy way out of it for liberals and for Democrats. But I do want to suggest that we take a deeper look at this issue and try to understand why it has the kind of massive grassroots appeal on the right that it does. Okay? And I sort of take this closer look in the book, and I'm not saying that I have a definitive answer on this at all, but one of the things that really interests me about the abortion issue is a huge part of the anger over it is anger at judicial activism, okay? Not at the specific operation of abortion itself, but at Roe v. Wade, at the idea of judicial overreaching, and also at the idea of that you remember, and whether you know this or not, this is the abortion, the pro-life movement knows this very, very well, that the Roe v. Wade and the whole liberal argument on abortion was done at the behest of the medical community, and that the world of medicine has always been caught up in this. And so for conservatives, it poses a perfect way of setting up this kind of populist opposition, because it's not just the people against, being against abortion. It's the people against these very specific elites, the judiciary and the medical world, against professionals. And I think this is, when you get right down to it, this is the heart of conservative populism, is a form of anti-intellectualism. Okay? It's replaced your sort of old school way of talking about class with a new way where instead of it being, blue collar versus white collar, average workers against the Fortune 500. It's you and me, it's all of us against these overeducated people who, because they have some, diploma on the wall from some fancy Eastern college, they get to tell the rest of us how to lead their lives. And this is immensely powerful. And it goes totally unanswered. No answer from liberals, from Democrats. And that is, in my opinion, one of the things that makes the abortion issue so powerful. And we have to figure out a way to beat that.
The Wall Street Journal editorial page this morning on the issue of judicial nominations and everything that's being talked about right now says that President Bush is going to make the Democrats mad anyway. So he just as well go ahead and renominate all those judges that he couldn't get through last time, and to make sure that he does, according to the editorial, that he shouldn't select another blank slate like David Souter if he has another nomination to the court.
Yeah, that's liberal media bias right there. That's liberal media speaking. Is what that. I'm sorry, I'm just kidding about that. But yeah, well, look, he did win a majority. He's got a majority in both houses of Congress. He should be able to do what he wants.
But this is one of the things that Democrats, you say, would need to really.
I think they will fight. Another point that I make in the book, and this is, I can't emphasize this enough, is that. Conservatives win these smashing electoral victories every couple of years, and they do it on the basis of values. When it came out on election night or the day after the election that the values issues had once again triumphed over other issues, even the war on terrorism, the values issues were more important. This shocked many people, but it shouldn't have, because this is ongoing. It's been happening for a really long time. What fascinates me is that while these issues are this is how conservatives appeal to a mass electorate. This is how they've won over, from the Goldwater days to our own, how they have become the dominant party that they have. And yet, once they win those elections, and once they're in office, they almost never do anything on the cultural front, on the values front. Never. Look at Bush's first day after the election. What did he say? What are his priorities? Number one, and this is when they're saying, look, he won on values issues. The gay marriage thing, he won because of that. He goes out there and says, I'm going to privatize Social Security. Surprise! I'm privatizing Social Security. Number two, I'm going to replace the graduated income tax with something that doesn't weigh so heavily on the rich. That's what they're about. So it's always this kind of bait and switch, this kind of dance. So I don't think, I don't know, maybe Bush will, maybe he'll gamble, maybe he'll spend his political capital trying to get Roe v. Wade overturned, but I doubt it.
Springfield, Ohio. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for C-SPAN. It's my first time calling, so but I get to watch every morning, and it's awesome. I guess I want to say I really respect you anchor persons for putting up with some of us who call, and some of us are really out of control. But I think I want to throw back to earlier from David Frum's unction to the president to bring more Democrat personnel into his cabinet or into some part of his cabinet. I think it's a great idea. I'm a registered Democrat who has voted Republican several times, including the recent ticket. And I think what our author is saying, or I guess what we're hearing is that Democrats have lost a grip on what appeals to Kansas, what appeals to Ohio, and I think that probably being in the mix of it, I'm a self-employed person who deals with the public, is that's because we get burnt out on the rantings. We hear that, and I even addressed this with several members of the Democratic Party locally. For the last 4 years, I've heard rant, George Bush hatred, but no real answers, no real ideas, no real new things. I've heard lots of reverse bigotry and things like this. Commercials that have been aired on radio stations locally. My kids are much younger and they're teenagers, and they're listening to cultural hip hop and things like this. It's bigotry. It's just blatant hatred, and that's not going to appeal in long term. And
thanks, Ohio. Mr. Frank.
The problem is that I don't know specifically what he's talking about.
Well, specifically, he was talking about David Fromm's piece in this morning's
Wall Street
Journal.
I understood
that.
But
The other part.
The other thing about more liberal bias, by the way. But the other I'm just kidding. I have great respect for David Fromm. But the other thing about the reverse bigotry, I don't know specifically what he's referring to, but this is, I want to point out that this is also a topic that comes up constantly when you talk to conservatives, that they believe that they are that they are society's real victims, that they are the true victims of the world that we live in, and they are the persecuted class. They're the ones who are discriminated against. They talk about this all the time. There's even a book out right now, I think it's in paperback right now, by Rush Limbaugh's brother, called, it has one of these one-word titles that conservatives love. It's called, arrogance, treason, this one's called persecution. And the idea is that conservative Christians are persecuted right here, right now in the U.S. of A., that there's religious persecution going on all around us. And what they mean by this is that people say mean things. People say mean things, and that's persecution. People, like the caller described, and this is the culture of conservatism. This idea that conservatives are the real persecuted class is very, very powerful. And look, there is obviously a grain of validity to it. I mean, I'm not denying what the guy says is true. It probably is.
Are you saying it's this kind of a victimhood?
Yes, they have a whole culture of victimhood. Yeah, absolutely.
Kane in New Hampshire. Hello.
Oh, good morning.
Morning.
I think your book is right on top. I'm going to get it as a guideline. In fact, I was jotting down this morning a list of things that the Democrats have to respond to. They're really GOP lies. Of course, this is used to be a Republican state. This last time it went big for Kerry, and they got the union leader there. It's just a Republican rag, and then the big radio station. And it was way back, because I grew up during the Second World War and served in Korea. So our English teacher really explained to us about the editorials and the propaganda pages in the paper. I mean, these guys make Adolf Hitler and his crew look like purse snatchers. In fact, here's one good GOP lie they use, and nobody responds to it. Says, oh yeah, Kerry's going to tax your Social Security. Clinton, he taxed your Social Security. Well, that is a big lie, because once you get on Social Security, you don't pay any taxes. You don't even file until you make over $25,000. But you see, they need a radio program, a TV station, from just Soros and a bunch of them, to counter Fox. I never see such a big a bunch of lies in my life. And then another new one they just started with is home ownership. Well, good God. That started back after the Second World War, when they come out with the GI Bill, and they freed up money, and the country didn't prosper because we won the war. It prospered 15 years later because you give about 14 million veterans the GI Bill of Rights, and they could buy a house or build a house.
Thanks, New Hampshire. Any reaction to his call?
He raised several very important points about taxation and Social Security, but that's kind of complicated. But the other point that he raised about institution building, that there is a whole network of organizations out there on the right. He mentioned Fox News, but there's obviously many radio shows here in Washington. As I drove over here this morning, you pass, well, I didn't pass it, but the Heritage Foundation, which is right over there, the Cato Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, and on and on and on and on and on. And there's from great to small with different specialties that they focus on, and these are all lavishly funded, of course, by sort of upper class America, and there is no counterpart on the left. I mean, there's nothing. There are some very sort of weak liberal think tanks here in D.C. I mean, their heart's in the right place, and I love them, but they don't have anywhere near the kind of clout. And this is because conservatives, very wisely, have since 1968, again, or even going further back, since '64, since the Great Goldwater disaster, have put everything they've got into institution building, and the liberals haven't responded at all. They've done nothing, or very, very little. You started to see a little bit of that this year, and that's super important that they engage in combat on that level.
We're going to go to Kentucky next. Stearns, Kentucky.
Good morning.
Morning.
One thing I would like to thank C-SPAN for is just before the election, you had the different candidates, libertarians, Green Party, Socialist, Constitutionalists. I thought that was very interesting, and the interesting thing about it, too, was the Socialists and the Green Party, if you take the name off and show what they were standing for, it was the same as the Democratic Party. As far as what has happened to the Democrats, if you take the morals of the Bible and the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, which our country was founded on, they're getting further and further away from this. Just like, they've become the party of the elitist. Rosie O'Donnell, Ted Kennedy, these are people that are devout anti-gunners, and still they have armed guards.
Guns? The Bible mentions guns?
We should have the right to protect ourselves. James Madison said that the right to bear arms was considered necessary to prevent a tyrannical government, which is what we had here at the time our government was formed.
Now, I have a question. I actually have a question for the caller,
sure,
which is the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount. Where's that? What about the the rich man in the eye of the camel, or the eye of the needle in the camel? Oh well, what the hell? I can't forget it.
What about that, Kentucky?
It's too early in the morning for me.
I think it's our responsibility as Christians to protect ourselves and our families. And after you go home, there's no place else to go. You either stand and fight, or you're slain. And our police forces, all they do is come and clean up the mess after it's over with. I think we have a right to defend ourselves.
Thanks, Kentucky. Any other reaction to us?
Well, I was just thinking, the other day, I was reading. Look, what he said about the Democrats identifying themselves with elitists. This is the classic complaint, and that's until the Democrats find a way of beating that argument, they're going to continue to lose. He's basically he has expressed the sort of the attitudes that I try to describe in the book, and that's great. About the Bible, though, the thing that gets me, the sort of spokesman for fundamentalism in the early part of the 20th century was a guy called William Jennings Bryan, a Democrat, a liberal. But he was more than a liberal. This guy was like, on today's standards, way far to the left. Was openly fought, against imperialism, resigned from Woodrow Wilson's cabinet in 1915 rather than have anything to do with the First World War. And he was the spokesman for fundamentalism in America. I always wonder, another thing. The other day I was reading the autobiography of Lincoln Steffens. This is one of these, books from the... he was a muckraker from the turn of the last century, and it's a book that was once very popular, like in the 1930s, and it's not widely read anymore. But in it he describes the first time he read the New Testament. And he couldn't understand how anybody could come away after reading that and thinking that it was a conservative document, and that it had anything to do with upholding, the power of money. for him, it struck him as intensely radical. And, you know, it's always sort of struck me the same way. And, you know, I understand what the caller was saying, but the alliance between between fundamentalism and Wall Street, it just is so unnatural. It's so unnatural.
Vancouver, Washington.
Good morning, Mr. Frank. I'm 33 years old, and I'm originally from Aurora, Illinois, which unfortunately is remembered more for its part in Wayne's World than it is as the home of the Patco strike, which pretty much began the destruction of the labor movement in this country. I proudly voted for Walt Brown of the Socialist Party USA this election, and I was wondering what your opinion would be about a rebirth of that movement in the Midwest. I first came across you on C-SPAN back in '97, and you were speaking at the Brecht Forum in the New York Marxist School. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little also. And I've got a copy of your book, One Market Under God, which I recommend to everyone. And I've got a copy of Baffling number 6, titled Dark Age, which I think marks you as, you know, the writer of my generation, quite frankly. I think you're brilliant. And my last question would be, could you comment a little about Doug Henwood and his book, Wall Street? I think here's a man who you know, forecasted the entire financial meltdown, and he never got any press for it. Thank you.
That's that's Doug Henwood, who he referred to there, is a great friend of mine, and also one of the one of the best economics writers of our time. And he's not a trained economist, so he writes like you and me, which is a huge plus in my mind. And he totally described what would go on, what would happen in the new economy years in the 1990s, well before it actually took place. It's an astonishing book. The book is called Wall Street. You know, and it's, you know, if you want to understand why we are in the situation that we are, and, you know, instead of worrying about the swirling clouds of, you know, the liberals are doing this and the liberals are controlling my life, and, you know, pick up this book, Wall Street, and you know, you'll understand, you know, why things actually happen the way they are. And it's not a conspiracy theory. It's all journalism. Everything is documented. Fantastic stuff. My own book that he referred to, One Market Under God, is kind of is a similar sort of thing, but it's about the culture of the new economy. And I wrote it in '98 and '99, and I would turn on my TV to one of your rival networks. There's a network in America. Foreign viewers might not know this. There's a network in America that only covers the stock market. And I remember when they started up, I couldn't believe it, and so I would watch that all the time while I was writing this book, and it's about the kind of the culture of the new economy, the sort of the manias, the funny ideas, and the consensus about the free market faith. And, excuse me. Anyhow, like I'm still very fond of this book. It's called One Market Under God. But the thing that amazes me, I wrote that came out before the crash. It came out in 2000. Mm-hmm. And I describe in it a consensus between Democrats and Republicans, with the left and liberals pretty much being out of the picture, about the virtues of the free market, and this belief that the free market somehow expresses the popular will, that the free market is somehow democratic, and, you know, that Wall Street is a more accurate, you know, the ticker of the Dow is a more accurate indicator of our, you know, of what we think and what we believe than our actual democracy itself, actual elections itself. And this is a widespread faith in the 90s. What amazes me is that in the aftermath of the collapse, that view hasn't gone away, hasn't even really been challenged, and that's extraordinary. I mean, the collapse in the NASDAQ in 2000, 2001, and then after that, the discovery of corruption and all these sort of high-flying new economy firms, you know, the staggering refutation of all the faiths of the 1990s, and we proceed here in Washington as though those faiths were still intact, as though nothing had happened. I mean, you still don't have anybody. I mean, people still believe this kind of market populism, this idea that markets are just wonderful. You know, they understand the popular voice. They fix prices in a perfectly just manner. They are omniscient. You know, it's the invisible hand. It's almost a deity. And that view hasn't really been challenged.
Are you challenging it?
I tried to. That was 4 years ago.
Next is Wichita, Kansas.
All right.
Good morning.
Morning.
I profoundly disagree with the left-wing viewpoint of your author there, and would suggest to the viewers out there that if they Google the title, "What's the Matter with Kansas?" they will discover a very famous essay written by William Allen White in the 1890s. In fact, it was used by the McKinley forces during the campaign against the populists he seems to enjoy so much. And Mr. Frank's...
It's mentioned in the book, by the way.
Excuse me?
It's mentioned in the book. The
Yes,
William Allen White essay.
But you did not copy the essay itself, and I think it's important for the listeners and readers out there to actually read what Mr. White had to say 108 years ago in terms of the problems that Kansas faced then and arguably faces now, because we have a problem in Kansas, but it's a problem of excessive government. Our income is lower than the national average, and our spending has grown so badly out of control that the state budget had its first $1 billion budget in 1974, and just a couple of years ago we went over $10 billion. So it's not a lack of government that we have here. Our problem is that we have too much government, actually. But I'd like the author to address the fact that his title has absconded with Mr. White's title and is in 180 degrees opposite from the intent of the essay. And if the viewers out there want to check it out, just Google and you can pick up online William Allen White's very famous essay from the 1896. It was actually used by the McKinley forces against William Jennings Bryan in the election, where Kansas went for Bryan in that election. Thank you.
Thanks, Wichita.
Yeah, that's all mentioned in the book, and if you go to my website, you'll find further references to it. The website is tcfrank.com. I believe I even have links that you can find William Allen White's famous essay all over the internet, and it's also in his autobiography and in the anthology that he put out of his writing. And I did it, the reason I took his title, or used his title, it's homage in one sense. I hate that word. It's homage. It's an homage to William Allen White, who's one of the sort of my heroes. And it's also, I want people to read that essay, because conservatism then had a very different feel to it than conservatism today. The William Allen White essay, What's the Matter with Kansas, is this angry attack. As I said earlier, Kansas was the hotbed of populism, this kind of radical movement. And William Allen White, fresh out of college, editor of the Emporia Gazette, was looking around him, and by the way, a staunch conservative Republican at the time, looking around him at the state and seeing what the populists were demanding and what they were doing, and he couldn't believe it. And the point of his essay is, you working class people get back in your place, and you leave us alone. We know what we're doing. We, the people who own this state. And he's very forthright about it. And it's what's the matter with Kansas? And as the caller mentioned, this was picked up by the McKinley forces and used, reprinted all over the country in millions of copies for use against William Jennings Bryan. The idea being that liberals or populists are absolutely have no idea what they're doing, and this is there's something. Well, this is an old way of looking at radical movements like that. Today's Republican Party, of course, would never ever say such a thing. Today, it's all they're the populists, and this is the intriguing thing, is that Kansas is today swept by another populist movement, but this one going 180, as the caller mentioned, 180 degrees different from the original one, to the point where I found right-wingers in Kansas that are demanding to bring back the gold standard, which you will recall was one of the populist sort of bête noirs. They hated the gold standard, but now they want to bring it back, damn it. And so it's another populist revolt sweeping the state, but pushing from the politics, all going in the other direction. But otherwise, they use the same language. They rail against elites. They rail against the cosmopolitan big cities of the coast, the blue states, and this kind of thing, centralized power, the top-down judiciary, all of this stuff. It is populism, but going the other direction. Now, one other thing I always like to, whenever you talk about William Allen White, who, as I mentioned, is sort of a hero of mine, you have to point out that William Allen White himself changed his opinion later, and how would you put this? Retracted the views that he expressed in that famous... This is the editorial that made him famous.
Right.
Before that, nobody knew who he was, and this made him nationally known. And he went on to become the sort of unofficial spokesman for small-town America, and won the Pulitzer Prize. I think won it more than once. And but later in life became what we used to call a progressive, a left-wing Republican, and sort of made it very explicit that he didn't so much apologize for the views in that, but distance himself from the early views and accepted the politics of populism, the policies of populism, if not the actual actors.
Where did you grow up in Kansas?
Johnson County, which is the suburbs of Kansas City. And it's funny about me and populism. I went to the University of Kansas out of high school, and I'll never forget. So they don't teach you about populism when you're growing up in Kansas, or they didn't then. This is in the 70s and 80s. But they do teach you about why you're different than the people in Missouri, right? Because we know who they were. They're bad. Because Kansas fought this border war with Missouri, so we know all about that. John Brown, all this sort of thing. But they don't teach you. They don't tell you about populism. This is a tough sticking point in Kansas history. And there's no monuments to it that I know of, except for one that I sort of describe in the book. There's no real public monuments to populism in the state. But so I didn't know about it. And I was at the University of Kansas, and I was in they have one of these great libraries with open stacks, and I was wandering around in the stacks, and I came across a shelf of books, and it must have been 20 or 30 copies of a book called The Populist Revolt, published in 1931 by John Hicks, who was a great historian of that era. And I thought, what is this? Why do they have 30 copies of this book? And I pulled one down, and by God, it was about Kansas. And it was about stuff that had happened in my home state, and it was about this movement that's very sympathetic. It's average people rising up against the powerful, average people, sweeping through the small towns and throwing out the slick small town lawyers and the kind of the state establishment, and taking over the institutions of government by themselves and running them in their own interest. And it's an inspiring story, and I had never heard it before, and I've been sort of captured by that all my life. And also by William Allen White's response to it, which I should say, it's also another reason it's worth reading. He was a hell of a writer. And it's the way he just took the bark off the populists. I mean, it's another thing that I admire his ability there. By the way, I also refer to it in the earlier book, One Market Under God. I talk about his essay, What's the Matter with Kansas? I refer to it all the time.
Mesa, Arizona.
Good morning.
Morning.
I haven't read your book yet, Mr. Frank, but I intend to. But the thing I wanted to say is sometimes, to begin with, I'm embarrassed to be in a red state. But the thing I think that really bothers people that vote and get out and try to do their best is people talk as if Bush won 2000, and in the final analysis, Gore won 2000. Now they're saying, oh, how easily he won 04. Well, now it's starting to come out with all the votes in Ohio at one counted and all this stuff. And in Ohio, Kerry was drawing crowds of 90,000, 60,000, 80,000. Bush had little small crowds compared to that. So I don't think we're ever going to have any coming together in this country until we have an honest election. And that includes getting rid of Diebold and all those machines that were purposely made so that they could switch the votes around. And they say you can switch them around and there's no way you can check it. Why should America be voting like that? It makes people like me just don't even want to vote anymore. And also,
Caller, I'm going to let it go at that because we have a lot of people in line. Thank you very much.
I don't know about what's going on in Ohio with the vote count. I thought Bush won it fair and square, but then again, that's what it said in the New York Times. We all know whose side they're on, right?
Forsyth, Missouri. Go ahead, Forsyth.
I would like Mr. Frank's definition.
Caller, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to make you turn down your television set all the way. If you don't, we're getting a lot of feedback. We can't even hear you.
I understand.
Thank you.
I would like Mr. Frank's definition of values and morality. He is a wordsmith. Does that apply just to the religious right or religious people? Just give us a few words as described in Webster's dictionary applied to morality and values?
Wow, this is something where I'm no good at giving Webster's definitions of things. I'm sorry, but I would say that the caller, maybe the caller has a definition herself.
She's already gone. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I left her go.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have one, but I will say this: that the word values is code for culture wars. Mm-hmm. We all know what that means. Whether it's gay marriage this year or flag burning back in 1988, or we all know what we mean by the culture wars, and this is a phenomenon that fascinates me, always has, because on the one hand it's so deeply resonant and so powerful, all of these issues, and then on the other hand it always winds up electing people whose values, and then the caller sort of started to suggest this, whose values are Wall Street's values. And that's a different way of using the word value, where it's just about the dollar sign. Do liberals have values? Well, I know I do. I'm a liberal, and I think that liberals could easily reclaim the values debate. Look, the thing is that we have to fight this battle, the electoral battle. We have to fight it the same way Republicans have. Democrats have to figure out ways to fracture the Republican coalition in the same way, and this is what wedge issues. Another term for the values issues, culture war issues, is wedge issues. And what this means, what this describes, is an issue that you use to fracture, to break off bits of the old New Deal coalition. Okay, and that's the idea behind all of these culture war issues, is get this little segment of the old Democratic coalition with this issue, get that segment of them with that issue. None of these issues appeal to a large majority, not even the abortion issue, the most powerful wedge issue of them all. These people are still, the pro-lifers are still, I think, a minority in terms of the actual population, but it's very effective in hammering the Democratic coalition. Democrats have to do this. They have to find the weak points in the Republican coalition and strike at those points. Now, do you mind if I keep going?
Go ahead.
Let me just say what that weak point is. Mm-hmm. As long as I've brought this up. The Republican coalition is two groups. On the one hand, traditional business Republicans, Wall Street, gave more money to Bush this year than ever before because they want that Social Security money, and they're going to get it. And then the other part of the coalition is the family values voters, the culture war voters, who tend to be blue-collar people who have been brought over from the sort of traditional loyalty to the Democratic Party, have been brought over to the Republicans by the values issues. And look, these two groups really don't have that many interests in common. Okay? The way you break this coalition apart is by talking about how their interests conflict. And their interests conflict in a lot of ways. Now, the problem is, to talk about that, you've got to talk about the role of business in our culture. You've got to talk about the power of Wall Street. You have to talk about those sort of, that old school economic populism that Democrats have tried to be getting away from. They've been trying to get away from for quite a while now. So, where does that leave us? Mm-hmm. Beats me.
Buffalo Grove, Illinois.
Yeah, I'm one of those liberals up there in the blue state that voted for Kerry, sorry. But I was born in Kansas. In fact, all my sisters, I was born in Harrington and Wichita and McPherson. Those should ring a bell. But since then, like you, moved on. My father was a minister. And but the thing that gets me about the division in this country is the Republicans, like you're saying. People like Maureen McDowd just wrote a column. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I mispronounced her name. About how pathetic it is, how they, lay the Republicans use these wedge issues, just like Howard Dean said so well, God, guns, and gays, and that's what it's come down to. And they make these divisions when really, Bush is a cowboy image that they appeals to them, but really it disguises this Wall Street fundamentalism, for the Republicans, really, that they really are for money and wealth and keeping that from the middle class.
Buffalo Grove, let me just ask you a question. Your relatives in Kansas, in those towns, in Harrington and McPherson, which I presume are pretty small.
Right.
How do they feel about the Democrats or liberals who would live in an area like Mr. Frank in the Mission Hills, the suburbs of Kansas City?
Well, I actually moved. We all moved when we were all born there. Then we moved up. My father had a pastor. He was a pastor. He moved up to New York, and so we were raised in the north.
I see.
You know, but we traveled back to Kansas, and I can recall the wonderful feeling, values and all that. I can understand it, but what I don't understand is how. I'm not pro-abortion. No liberal is pro-abortion. It's that we want people to have choice in this country. That's what our democracy was founded on. That's what Howard Dean wanted to get back to, and that's what Kerry was trying to say. It just didn't get through. I mean, how do you break through? I just, being a person of faith, I just don't see fundamentally how we can live as a United States and not be able to see the issues in a more objective manner.
Mr. Frank, thank you. Mr. Frank.
Let's
Has
see.
she made your argument?
Yes, I thought that was very eloquent and well put. And I would like to talk about what you. Well, let me first say that I go back to Kansas obviously all the time, because I wrote the book. I love it there. It's funny. It's in some ways I'm just totally at peace when I'm there. It's funny how much I like the place because politically I'm so out of step with the majority there. But
one would say that Mission Hills is a long way from
Wichita.
From Wichita, but
Mission
those
Hills
you're
is
talking about big cities. How about the really tiny ones in the western part of the state?
Yeah. Well, they've a lot of those towns have been really, really hard hit. I mean, we should point out to viewers, first of all, that what you're referring to, Mission Hills, is a little suburb that I grew up in, and it's very small and super, super affluent. It's one of those kind of things, like a gated community, only a little bigger, and built in the 1920s before they had such things. And anyhow, it's for people in Kansas. Or for people in the Kansas City area anyway, and I guess for a lot of the rest of the state, it's a symbol of concentrated wealth. And that's what it is. It is the state's elite, or a big part of the state's elite, living next door to each other. I mean, the corporate elite, and I describe this in the book, that these people live just a few doors down from one another. This guy runs Corporation X, this guy runs Corporation Y. All these millionaires.
Pizza Hut was founded there.
That's Wichita.
That's Wichita. Coke Industries?
Yeah, Wichita. Yeah. Anyhow, when I would talk to people, when I would talk to conservatives, and as I said, the divide between the conservatives and the moderates in Kansas is a class, or it boils down essentially to a class divide. They would, we would talk about Mission Hills, and we'd talk about the symbolism of that. And what you constantly find is this confusion of that with liberalism, of this distaste for financial elites and for the people who, and they know who that is. They know who people who live in Mission Hills, and that they're very wealthy, and that they own the state, and they own, what they say goes, and they have power, and you don't. But when they describe them, they always say those liberals. And that's a very, in point of fact, they aren't liberals. The neighborhood went for Goldwater by like 70%, went for Bush by 7, in 2000, it went by 70% for Bush. I don't know what it did this time. But I thought that was a very telling, that confusion of, and because in their eyes, these people are liberals. They tend to be moderate Republicans. They're pro-choice. They're, if you meet them, they seem like, very tolerant individuals. And
highly educated.
Highly educated, right. And they fit the kind of the blue state stereotype. They have Volvos, they like imported products, all that sort of stuff. But they vote Republican. Anyhow.
This is the book, What's the Matter with Kansas? How Conservatives Won the Heart of America. Our guest has been Thomas Frank. Thanks very much for joining us.
It was my pleasure. It was a lot of fun.
And you have a new baby at home?
That's right. We have a baby born on Friday.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Eisenhower, So, but in recent years, the state has moved further and further to the right, and all based on values issues, the culture war issues, and that fascinates me. So it's an in-depth study of that.
Why did you choose Kansas as kind of a microcosm of these others, of what's going on in these states?
Well, for one thing, because it's my home state. So it made it easy to do the research because I still, I have I have friends there, and it's a place that's always fascinated me. It's my home state, and its story is rarely told, that sort of thing. But it's also, Kansas is traditionally used by journalists as a microcosm of America. It's the most average place in America. This is, they say this because it's right in the middle, But also statistically, if you look at the numbers, it actually is very close to the average. In any ranking of the states, it's always number 25, except for in tourism, where it's absolutely last, because it's so familiar. You've been there, you've seen what Kansas is like. It's like everywhere else.
So back to
I'm kidding, of course.
I realize that. So back to this election. Why did people vote against their economic interest, in your opinion?
Well, that's a big question, and it takes me 300 pages to answer it in the book. And so I'll try to give you the condensed version. And the bottom line is this: that the conservative movement, the Republican Party also in America, have been very successful at describing, at reaching out to blue-collar voters, and at describing themselves as representatives of the angry, hard-done-by, average American. And this is the essential point about the culture wars that that liberals and Democrats never seem to understand, that this is really about class. That in some ways all of these things are a way of talking about class without talking about the economic aspect of class. And it's very obvious if you watch Bill O'Reilly or read their books or something like that. These people talk about class all the time. By these people, I mean conservatives. Talk about class all the time. In Kansas, the divide, you can see it on the map, the divide between, there's very few Democrats there, even fewer liberals. The main divide is between your old school moderate Republicans and your conservative Republicans. And the divide is between working class neighborhoods and your affluent upper middle class neighborhoods. So that's to make a very, very, very long story short. That's what it's about. It's about this kind of cultural populism. And you've been seeing it every 4 years for some time. Yeah, more or less, yeah. Well, I mean, we can go back over the elections and talk about the issues, And so in 4 years, what do Democrats need to do to change that? See, this is where I'm that was a big sigh. I know, I'm out of my element. I'm fundamentally, I'm a kind of a person that looks backward. I'm a historian. And I like talking about the past, and talking about the future is more difficult for me. And also, I should point out that I just moved to D.C. I'm not from here. I don't understand this town, and I'm no good at polls, and I'm no good at national political strategy. But I can say, in the big cultural battle, the great war of position that goes on between the two parties, the Democrats have to come up with a way to defuse culture war populism. They have to come up, and it seems to me that the obvious way is, and this should be easy for the Democrats, because once upon a time they had a very clear and straightforward way of talking to blue-collar voters. That was them. That was who they were. Think of Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman from Kansas City. That's who Democrats were, and they have to recover that way of speaking to those people, to those voters. They have to be able to challenge this kind of the kind of right-wing populist revolt that you see sweeping across states like Kansas and much of the middle of America, and ironically states that were once very liberal, if not outright radical. You actually give some history where Kansas was liberal. Yeah, well, I wouldn't say liberal. It was it was radical 100 years ago. Kansas was, well, it goes back further than that. The state was settled by abolitionists and free soilers that went there deliberately to block slave owners from Missouri moving west. And in the 1890s, the state was swept over by what they called populism, which was a sort of radical movement of farmers and workers. And it was this very inspiring moment. All my life I've read books about populism, and I always thought, gee, what a great moment that was. and then Kansas remained, after that it was always Republican. Kansas has always been loyal to the Republican Party because of its Civil War, its origins in the Civil War. But it was a different sort of republicanism, personified by people like William Allen White, who was, by today's standards, on the left, or Alf Landon even, who was the Republican candidate in 1936, but again, by today's standards, very moderate or to liberal, or even Dwight.
Well, Thomas Frank is with us this morning. He's the author of this book, What's the Matter with Kansas? How Conservatives Won the Heart of America. Good morning, Mr. Frank.
How you doing?
Fine. What happened?
What happened?
What happened
in the election?
In the election that mirrored what you wrote about in this book?
It's kind of funny. It's what happened in the election is what happened to Kansas about 15 years ago, isn't it? It's you know, the sort of moderates and the centrists just absolutely swamped by the right, and it should be. You know, the thing is that this should be. It shouldn't be a surprise to anybody anymore that this kind of thing goes on. It's been happening since, well, the phenomenon that we saw last Tuesday, you know, of people voting for their values over their economic interests, or, you know, in a very rough sense, has been going on since 1968. Okay, the Republicans and the conservatives have been using the wedge issues, the culture war issues, with great effect ever since then. What astonishes me is that the Democrats still don't really have a way of defusing this. They don't seem to understand what's happening to them and why. And it keeps happening. Every 4 years it happens again. It's very, very frustrating. But so what happened in Kansas, what my book is about the sort of the ongoing power of these issues.